In this video, I will be walking you through my current orchestral production template. There will be several considerations that I will cover and aspects that you need to be thinking about when you're building your own template. For the most part, everything that I'm going to be talking about can be applied to any DAW and any sample libraries and plugins. So I'm not going to be focusing on specific software libraries and plugins. It'll be more of a high-level approach as to how you should be thinking about building your own template and what are the important factors to consider so that you have enough freedom to approach any kind of production as you move forward. Alright, let's get straight into it. I'm running Cubase as my DAW on the left of the screen here, and I also have Vienna Ensemble Pro on the right side of the screen here. The way that this is organized is that I let VE Pro handle all of the samples, and all of the audio processing and MIDI track management happens inside of Cubase. This is primarily to let each software do what, in my opinion, it's best at doing. The other advantage with VE Pro is that you can host multiple servers and instances across a network. So in the future, if you get a more powerful computer with more disks, more memory, you can always put VE Pro on that, or if you have multiple machines, on them, and then Cubase can run on a regular machine or even a laptop because it becomes a lightweight session since it's not doing all the heavy lifting of trying to manage samples from your disks and so on and so forth. In terms of track organization, I follow the orchestral score order. This is my personal preference. It finally depends on you, but if you're going to be working with live musicians, having a correlation between your MIDI tracks as you look at them visually, top to down, left to right, and a notation software like Dorico or Sibelius or Finale or whatever other software you use, I find it personally easier in my workflow to use the orchestral score order because then I can quickly ratify notation against the MIDI notation that I have in Cubase. That being said, the orchestral score order is woodwinds, brass, percussion, piano and harp, sometimes choir and voices as well, and then strings at the bottom. These are all folder tracks that help me organize literally hundreds of MIDI tracks in my template. As you can see, they're color-coded to my personal preferences. I use a color scheme. I use the same or very similar color scheme both within Cubase and Vienna Ensemble Pro. On the bottom of the split screen here are the MIDI tracks in this particular case. So for example, these are all my flutes and they're all MIDI tracks. On the top half of the split screen are my other track types, and it's most importantly my VST instruments. You will notice that they follow a very similar color scheme, right from that inky blue for the flutes to the sea green for the bassoons. Even on the right here, on the left pane of Vienna Ensemble Pro, you see the VSL Woodwinds instance open right now, and even there I try and follow a very similar color scheme with the flutes having that inky blue and moving down to the sea green and the bassoons. The way that the routing is set up is that I have basically one instance of VE Pro per orchestral family. So one for woodwinds, one for brass, one for percussion. The only exception I make is for strings, where I have one instance per string library developer that I use. My piano and harp tracks are under percussion to keep my resources optimized. You can see them there. The reason I have separate instances per string library developer is primarily because the number of samples that you're managing with a single string section can be pretty large. Plus, the number of tracks that you need to manage, just visually, it just becomes easier. VE Pro can handle several hundreds of tracks per instance. I personally prefer having about 60-odd tracks at the most per instance, and this is just to make everything more manageable. The other thing is that each instance can be moved to different computers. If you have a larger setup, it keeps everything modular, so I prefer this method of doing it. The other thing that I use VE Pro for is its built-in integration with Vienna's other product, Mir Pro, which is their impulse response engine. Mir Pro basically allows you to put any audio source inside of their preset spaces. They have several preset spaces available. You can check it out on their website. These are physically modeled impulse response engines for several different spaces, including the famous silence stage, which is used to record the Vienna samples themselves. It is very, very deep, and it offers you a boatload of control. In this particular case, I have two spaces set up. This is the Sage Hall, and then I also have the Teldex studio in Berlin, which has been used to record many, many samples, including the Berlin series by Orchestral tools. It really depends on what kind of space you want to use. Of course, they don't have necessarily only large and medium-sized spaces. They have even smaller spaces available. These are two impulse responses that I use from Vienna. I do have a bunch of other reverbs as well, which I use within Cubase. But they work great, and MirPro is absolutely stunning in its ability to render realistic impulse response of a sound which has been placed in the spaces that they model. So definitely check out MirPro and VE Pro if your budget allows for it. Kudos to Vienna. Let's get into some of the considerations that I was mentioning earlier. What are the primary considerations you should be thinking about when you're building your template? There's really three high-level things you should be thinking about. The first two really are about when you're trying to produce or you're trying to compose using the DAW and then mix. And the third one can be done within the same session, but I personally prefer to do it within a different DAW session for a plethora of reasons, which I can get into later. The first of those considerations is track signal flow and control, which is really saying that from the rawest or driest form of track that you have available, all the way up to it being fully produced and mixed and blended in with the other tracks. What kind of control do you have over each track individually and within the various groups it becomes a part of? Now, obviously, you have dry libraries and wet libraries or semi-wet libraries. And in the case of the semi-wet or the wet library, the driest form you're going to have will have some reverb on it, and you can't get rid of it. Some libraries do offer you some semblance of close miking with very, very little room ambience. It varies from library to library. Then on the other hand, you have libraries like Vienna or LA scoring strings or sample modeling. These are all dry libraries, and you can get a lot more control over how it ends up sounding, right? That does not mean in any way that semi-wet or wet shouldn't be used. It's just a question of where and how you're going to be including it in your overall mix and blending it into the overall sound, right? The second consideration is balance. As your composition is evolving, your mix should evolve too. Mixing is really about balance, and a good orchestral composition which you're producing needs to be balanced throughout the evolution of the piece. Now, there's obviously the aspect of making sure that you compose properly, you orchestrate and arrange properly, making sure that you respect the natural limitations of being able to play on the various instruments and how they would end up sounding in relation to each other when played in a certain way or at a certain volume or in a certain register. In addition to that, once you've got the basics down and you've composed the piece and it's reasonably well orchestrated and mocked up at the compositional level, given that your composition is going to evolve throughout its timeline, there is going to be some fine-tuning you'll want to do, just a little bit of helping with the mix automation parameters that you have, right from simple fader automation to some level of EQ automation or reverb automation or compression automation, whatever it is. And that's what I'm referring to by balance. The ability to balance various sections or soloists against the rest of the material that's going on at the same time. Controlling what comes to the foreground, what should stay in the background, relative levels, clarity of counterpoint, or how tight the percussion or the bottom end is. All of that can be automated, and that is really where your production will shine. A word of caution here, you really shouldn't be fiddling with individual instruments during mixing unless there's a very specific solo part. There is some automation that you would need to do if you have a specific soloist or a specific single instrument that needs to stand out. All of that automation needs to happen, sure. But for the most part, you will be working with sections or entire families of instruments and not with single instruments. That should be really dealt with at the composition stage and the initial mock-up stage. don't try and fix those things at the mix stage, because for the most part, they will end up in disaster if they have not been mocked up correctly to begin with. You can use it to fine-tune things. With mixing, the idea is to use broad strokes, never to overdo things. You don't want to go crazy with even things like EQ or compression. Orchestral music has a very wide dynamic range, and we want to preserve that dynamic range. Trying to fix dynamic range issues by mixing is a recipe for disaster. The third and final consideration is mastering. Any piece of fine art craft, any product, a painting or a piece of furniture, it always has a finish. It could be a gloss finish or a matte finish depending on what product it is or the style of the object. But it does give you that pristine, high quality, made with a lot of care look. Mastering is really about that. It comes from the same philosophy. And so again, we use very, very broad strokes during mastering when it comes to anything, from volume automation to EQ to dynamic processing. Again, this is not commercial pop music, this is orchestral music, so everything that I say right now applies to the context of orchestral music production and not necessarily any other genre, right? So keep that in mind. Typically, you don't even want to work on a specific instrument or section here, or just the timpani or just the violin one section versus violin two. You should fix that at compositional plus mix stage. It's really about thinking of the bigger level sections, like combinations of sections, low strings versus high strings, short strings versus long strings. Likewise for woodwinds, brass, or percussion. If you've done a great job at the mix stage, then even one level up from there, which is just strings versus woodwinds versus brass versus percussion, right? You have to keep in mind that the original reason mastering was developed was because you had different media that you would be distributing the music on, from vinyls to cassettes to CDs. And ever since the digital revolution and the advent of streaming services, each streaming services has their own approach in how they treat the audio content that they host and stream. So having some idea of where and how you're going to be distributing your music in advance will help you prepare your content accordingly. There's plenty of resources and forums out there that describe the differences between these services, so those should get you up and running. I will not try and cover that in this video. Now, I've just covered three things, right? Track signal flow and control, balance, and what you need to think about in advance for mastering. To enable all of this, here are some guidelines I can recommend as part of building your own template and your workflows. Use functional track and folder organization. And what I mean by that is do what's efficient for your workflow. I follow the orchestral order because it works for me. Many composers follow the orchestral order because it works for them. That does not necessarily mean it works for you. Do what works for you. If you're going to be working with a lot of live musicians and where you need to prepare sheet notation and constantly go back and forth between notation software and your DAW, it's very likely that you will also end up following the orchestral order. Your mileage may vary. It's really up to you. The second thing is use color schemes. This is for consistency and easy location and correlation of different tracks. Just to give you an example, as you can see, my brass section is open right now, and I did allude to the example of the woodwinds earlier, but even if I opened up my brass, I still follow the same colors, so the yellow or that yellowish green down to the reds, from the French horns to the tuba, is followed in my MIDI tracks, is followed in my VST instrument tracks, and it is also followed for the most part within my VE Pro instance of brass, right? Like I said, it's an approximation, but it helps me get through the tracks quickly, identify what needs to be changed where, all of that really, really quickly. So that's my recommendation, use a color scheme. The other thing is use good routing practices to give you flexibility and control over each track right through the mix. For example, if I was to use woodwinds to demonstrate what I'm talking about, so when I open the woodwinds folder, I have flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, and then if I open the subfolder flutes, I have 4 MIDI tracks here. A3FL stands for 3 flutes in unison, and I similarly have a piccolo and flute 1 and flute 2. If I was to go back to my woodwinds instance in VE Pro on the right here, and if I expand my flutes folder there, you will see that I have a A3FL I have a PICC, which stands for piccolo, I have flute 1, and I have flute 2. Now, there are these additional tracks that you see in between. Those are additional buses that are related to the same VST instrument or track here. So basically what I do is I use these to separate long and short articulations on a per instrument basis. This is a practice I follow for woodwinds, brass, and for strings. I don't necessarily follow the same for percussion. It depends on what we're talking about, because percussion, for the most part, have fixed attacks and decays. They are not the kind of instruments that sustain. There are exceptions, and it really depends on what you're trying to do. So this allows separation of those articulations. I would have the same for things like oboes. So you'd see A3 oboes long, A3 oboes short, oboe 1 long, oboe 1 short, so on and so forth. The advantage of that is, of course, that if I was to go back in, all of those get sent to these two buses here, flutes long, flutes short, and those buses come back as returns into Cubase, which then I can treat differently. So for example, if I have my flutes long versus my flutes short, I can actually treat them differently depending on the context. Why do I need to treat those instrument articulations differently? Not all libraries come equal in terms of being able to get a very accurate sound for both short and long articulations. Some libraries excel at long articulations. Some libraries sound amazing at short articulations, but they're not as good at the long ones. Some are good at both, but they're not as good as the ones that are, outstanding at the long ones or outstanding at the short ones. Having this control here from the channel strip and inserts to the EQ or what kind of sends, everything is afforded here in terms of control. Now, let me quickly give you a couple of tips on reverb and impulse response that you may incorporate into your template. You can choose whatever reverbs you have available, but keep in mind that longer articulations work better with longer reverbs, and shorter articulations work better with shorter or no reverbs. Use convolution reverbs to place your instruments in a common setting, and then you can use an algorithmic reverb to blend them all in during mixing. For example, with my long flutes here, I've got two reverbs that I'm sending to. I could set up as many as I wanted to and then control them through automation and choose what I wanted to mix down. The other thing is that it's pre-fader, which means that this track is completely wet because my fader is at negative infinity, which basically means that there's no dry signal at all right now. But if I wanted to have more dry signal, then I would just push that fader up and I can bring in as much dry signal as I want back into the mix. An example of one of my reverbs or impulse response engines in Maid Pro, this is the Sage Hall instance. I have my woodwinds coming back in here, and if I was to expand that, you could see that they're coming in as the flutes, the oboes, the clarinets, and the bassoons. I could go as crazy as I wanted here. I could have it by instrument and place all of them here. That's just a lot more processing and load on the machine. So this still gets the job done, given that an orchestral section that uses everything is going to be pretty dense anyway. And even when it's not dense, I still retain the clarity of where that sound source is coming from in the overall stereo width and stereo field that the particular sound source has. For example, this trumpet section here, right? It has 3 players, which is a standard orchestral setup. Now, when you're setting up your instruments in ePro, every instrument has power pan, right? Now I could choose to set that up here. This is my stereo pan, and I can choose how narrow or wide I want it to be. But instead what I've done is, if I zoom in here, you can see the A3 trumpets, right? This is a trumpet ensemble here, and it's 3 trumpets. Now what I've done is, assuming this is the stereo width of this particular sound source, if I look at where it's originating from, which is basically this brass instance, if you notice on the right here, I have my ensemble. Of course, the A3 trumpets are the full stereo field, but trumpet 1 is on the right, trumpet 2 is in the middle, and then trumpet 3 is on the left. So what that essentially means is that relative to this stereo width, trumpet 1 would be here, trumpet 2 would be in the middle there, and trumpet 3 would be somewhere on the left, which is how they would be seated in a live setting. Same goes for any other section, trombones, clarinets, bassoons, so on and so forth. The next thing that we can talk about is when it comes to signal processing, you want to be very, very careful and subtle about using effects. Remember the returns that I was talking about, which came back in from ePro? Everything that I'm doing here is very, very subtle. So in this particular case, this is the flute's long. And if you notice, my values for my EQ are very, very small. It's, minus 1 dB or 2 dB more. Even my cues are really, really wide. One thing you will notice here is that I have added a high pass filter. This is massive cut on the low end that you can see here. It's at about 180 hertz and it's 48 dB cut on that slope. The first thing you have to understand that all the cuts that I made here do not affect the playing range of the instrument. They are outside of the playing range of the instrument. It's below. But a lot of these samples, when they're recorded, they have some amount of low end. What happens is when you send all of these to reverbs, many of them sum up those low ends over the various instruments, and it adds a build up here on the low end and the low mids. That causes a massive amount of boominess and muddiness in the mix. So cutting out all of that, the mix becomes a whole lot cleaner. Now, obviously, I wouldn't do this with something like the bassoons, because the bassoons are the low register of the woodwinds, right? A lot of the playing range of those instruments would be here, so you wouldn't want to apply those cuts. The tendency to sum and build up, you won't see as much of it in the high frequencies, so I won't always necessarily add a low pass. So for example, if I was to open up my bassoons, if you notice there's no EQ at all. Again, the point of all of this is that you should have control. Everything that you do is going to depend on your composition, what libraries you use, how you program them, how they go through the reverb and come back, and what's the resulting sound. And by having this level of control, you can literally make all kinds of compensations as required to make sure that the sound is natural and at the same time rich and balanced. At the bottom here is my mixer. I have two setups already there, two configurations. These are my orchestral VCA faders. If you remember, I did mention that you're not supposed to be making surgical changes to single instruments. Even if it's a solo instrument, it should be very, very subtle. These work with sections, so I have, the big high woodwinds or the medium low brass or so on and so forth. By big and medium, these are referring to the sizes of the spaces that the instruments are in. Now, by automating these VCA faders, the benefit that you stand to gain is that everything that you apply applies to the entire section. So if you've already got a balance set up, for example, if your violins are already set up and mixed in terms of their mixed levels, so you're mixing different libraries and violins one from one library, violins two from another library. This is just an example I'm giving you. And you find that you need to level balance them, and your violins one is 3 dB lower than violins two because they're coming from a different library. The VCA fader will maintain those relative differences in Cubase, and so as you drag that VCA fader up and down, for example, if I dropped my VCA fader at minus 3 dB, it wouldn't just subtract 3, it would do a relative change and make sure that the ratios between each of the faders being controlled together by the single VCA fader are maintained. That's how I control my orchestral faders. In addition to that, I have some group buses for both of my reverb halls, and then I have two outs, one going to my main set of monitors and one going, in this case, going to my headphone amp. Aside from that, I also have a bunch of ins and outs. I do have other configurations as well when I set up the project, but it's really project dependent and depends on what it entails. So am I going to be using a bunch of synths? I'd probably create one more configuration there. If I'm using other instruments or a band setting or vocals that are being used all over the place, or a choir which has been recorded, all of that would get their own configurations. Again, the idea is that you have about 20 faders that you're working with. It makes the screen space more manageable as opposed to trying to use a scroll bar to figure out where your fader is in the middle of all of this. It's just easy visually, right? Output channels are always on the right. The way my busing is set up is so that the output stems can be imported straight into a separate DAW session for mastering. Normally, after I'm done mixing, I like to work only at the audio level. It keeps the session lightweight as opposed to trying to handle a lot of VSTs. Once you know that there's no more surgical changes required, I normally like to give myself a little bit of a break between the mixing and the mastering stages. Your ears need some rest as well. Make sure that you have mastering reference tracks that you're also listening to. That's my approach to mastering. I've kind of covered my holistic approach. Work with your tools to make sure you have proper signal flow and control over every aspect of every track. When it comes to mixing, make sure that you have good balance. Start at the compositional stage, and then mixing really should be only about balance and nothing else. You shouldn't be doing anything that's surgical in nature. Keep in mind how you're going to be publishing your music. Is it going to be a streaming service? Are you going to be mastering it to a CD? What is that output format? And that'll help you decide what kind of mastering workflows you want to use. Again, to enable all of this, use things like functional track and folder organizational schemes for yourself. I use the orchestral order. That need not be what you use. It's up to you. Use color schemes if it's available to you from your DAW. It makes things more consistent. And when you're dealing with hundreds of tracks, it just makes things easier to locate. Use good routing practices to enable control. When it comes to reverbs, you can use any reverbs that you have. Just keep in mind the longer articulations work better with longer reverbs. Shorter articulations work better with shorter reverbs or no reverb. Don't try and fix things with EQ or at the mixing or the mastering stage. It's just something you want to avoid. Use very, very broad strokes. Keep things subtle. Orchestral music has a lot of dynamic range, has a lot of natural beauty to it that you want to maintain. Okay, I think that's about it. I hope this was helpful. Please leave your comments and feedback and any questions that you may have. I'm happy to try and look at them and respond to as many as I can. Thank you so much for sparing the time to watch this video. Have fun.